man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed, are healed, are healed.
Morning and welcome to the FAC Deerfoot campus, and a special welcome to those of you joining online. Thank you for spending part of your Sunday with us as we discover more of what God longs to do in our lives and in our families. My name's James, I'm one of the pastors here, and as Heather mentioned, we're partway through a series thinking about what it means for Jesus to heal us, and we called it In Pain and Suffering. We started out wondering about why Jesus would heal and looking at his compassion and his love and his great desire for his people. We thought about how Jesus heals, 5 different miraculous ways that impact us in different times and places, directly and supernaturally, or through doctors and medicine, through the wonder of our created bodies and its ability to heal itself, through grace sufficient that allows us to carry on when life is very challenging, and at the end of it all, a victorious end when death itself gives way to victory. If you missed any of those weekends, I'd encourage you to take the time to watch and listen and allow God to speak into your life. But today we come to another difficult topic, really. What suffering does. People often ask about suffering. They ask me, maybe they ask you about it. There's always a question about why. And I think one of the things that any of us can do really well is to take the time and ascertain, why would the person want to know? What's that all about? For some of us, it's an intellectual or philosophical kind of question, trying to figure out some of the mysteries of life. If God is really good, and God is really powerful, and he really exists, and he really is loving, then why does all this stuff happen? The clear assumption is that he can't be all of those things. He can't be powerful and good and loving and let this happen. Something's not quite right in the mix. And that's the way people begin to think. There's actually a fantastic book. You won't want to read it because it's long and it's very dull, but it's exceptionally well written by a guy called John Hick. It's called Evil and the God of Love. He's not a believer in Jesus, but he examines through history the study of this topic. It's often called theodicy, this mixture of philosophy and theology, trying to understand human suffering. And he writes this big fat book of history of ways Christians have thought about this over the years. And he comes to this surprising conclusion for somebody who doesn't overly believe in God. And that is simply it's not a strong enough argument to say that God doesn't exist. Yes, there are intellectual challenges, and yes, many of the explanations are not satisfying enough. And it's not overly straightforward, but there is no conclusive evidence that you could say God did not have a reason for what happens. Fascinating, perhaps. But most people that talk to me about suffering are not being particularly philosophical about it. Most people that are talking to me about suffering are experiencing it. This is very much personal and experiential for them. Either they or someone they love and care about has found themselves in the extremities of life, and life is hard, and they don't know what to do. They don't need a book of theology. They don't need my smart philosophical answers. But they are looking for hope and meaning and comfort. There are people, maybe some of you today, some of you watching online, struggling with physical pain, and life hurts. Everything hurts. Our bodies begin to wear out. They struggle to fight infection, have all sorts of things go wrong. My breakfast these days is always a coffee and an Advil. Like, what's that about? Many of us experience a degree of mental distress, though. Anxiety, depression, endless challenges that can really shatter us and break us. There are victims of abuse, traumatized, carrying lifelong scars with them, physical and emotional, memories that don't dissipate. And for many, our pain is relational. Being excluded, forgotten, unwanted, unloved, pushed aside, marginalized. K.G. Ramsey, in her little book, This Too Shall Last, says this: Suffering breaks our hearts wide open, and the overflow of sorrow, anger, and anxiety terrifies us. That's what suffering does. Suffering shatters people. It shatters our life. It shatters the people round about us. That's what suffering does. Where do we go with it? Well, today I'm going to take you to Jesus. But we're going to start first in the book of Isaiah, a prophet in the Old Testament. It's a big fat book if you've ever tried to read it. He goes on and on and on. It's a long book, it's a complicated book, but it's a fascinating book and beautiful. Handel used much of his text from the Messiah, his oratorio. He lifted straight out of Isaiah. There are some beautiful passages in there that are very relevant. And one of the features of the book of Isaiah are what are called the servant songs. There are 4 poems or songs that are contained in there, and each one is about this mysterious, unnamed person simply called the servant. You find them in chapters 42, 49, chapter 50, and then the 4th one, the last one, spills over from chapter 52 into chapter 53. And it's a portion of that I want to read to us this morning. And we know it's about the servant because in chapter 52, verse 11, where verse 13 where the song begins, it says, "See, my servant." But I just want to read a few of the verses from chapter 53 to you. Some of these words might be familiar, maybe from the Messiah, maybe because you've read it, maybe from Christmas carols. But these words, I think, speak deeply into our lives. Isaiah 53, verse 1. "Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. As one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Perhaps as you were listening, you might understand why those early followers of Jesus and the people who wrote the New Testament, the second part of our Bibles, why they would identify Jesus as being this servant, this suffering servant. Listen to these words from some of the writers of the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, preaching about Jesus, or Peter rather, preaching about Jesus in Acts chapter 3, he says, when God raised up his servant, key words, everybody knew what he was talking about. When God raised his servant, he sent him first to bless you by turning each of you from your wicked ways. Or the great missionary Apostle Paul, who traveled so much. And he says, but not all have obeyed the good news. And then directly says, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? They've all got Isaiah chapter 53 in mind. Or in the book of Hebrews, again, Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time. Not to deal with sin, but to save those eagerly awaiting for him. This idea of being offered up, it's right there, chapter 53. They've all read it. They all begin to see Jesus as they try to identify who the servant is. And in the verses we read together, it breaks into three little sections quite easily. The first three verses, we observe suffering. There's all this stuff going on. There's this servant who's despised. Nobody pays any attention to him. And if they do, it's just this derision or disgust. He's rejected. He's considered worthless and helpless. No one saw him as special. In fact, rather, they kind of turned away. Don't want to see this anymore. But in the central section, verses 4 through 6, Isaiah helps us to begin to see and examine his suffering and to learn something about ourselves. It was in our place that he suffered. We couldn't see it though. We didn't understand it. Then the last couple of verses, 7 through 9, we discover something shocking. That this servant was innocent, but he willingly did so, willingly took our place, willingly did this for love of us. It's that central part, though, that I want us to look at. And I'm going to read it again because I want you to look at it closely as we ask ourselves about the meaning of suffering and what suffering does. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, and yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've all turned to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Here's what I'm learning about suffering as I read these words in Isaiah. Jesus gets it. God is not remote. He's not ignoring you. He hasn't abandoned you. He hasn't given up on you. Jesus gets it. He really does. He identifies with us in our pain and suffering. By becoming human, he experiences life in all of its glory and joy and all of its heartache and agony just the way we do. By becoming a creature inside his own creation, he fully identified with us. He gets it. John, in his gospel account of Jesus, trying to help us understand the mystery of all this, would write, the Word became flesh, that's Jesus, the Word of God, became flesh and lived among us, and we've seen his glory. The glory is of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. I mean, think about it. The God of the universe becomes human. The one who spoke everything into existence is now crying for his milk. The one who holds all of the world together is now held in his mother's arms, unable to do a single thing for himself. Helpless. And as he grows up, he begins to experience the joy and the horror of being a human being. He knows what it is to cry at the graveside of a loved one. He knows what it means to be unhoused. Betrayal, always experienced that. Family drama, they wanted to come and lock him up. They thought he was nuts. Injustice, with all the cards stacked against him in a rigged trial. The shame of being crucified naked. The reality of abuse as he was tortured brutally to death. Forsaken by everybody, just about, as they all moved away and left him. Death. Jesus gets it. He identifies with us. He stands in radical solidarity with us, even in our pain. We talk a lot at FAC about joining Jesus in his great mission of making all things new. But the reality is it begins with Jesus joining us. He became one of us. He joined us in the frailty of our lives and stood in our place. Because that's why Jesus gets it. He came to rescue us. We learned about that a while ago as we took our time trying to think about the ways in which we could explain, how does Jesus save? It was our last sermon series. We talked about Jesus being the forerunner, the beginning of a brand new version of humanity. All of us born in Adam in a sense, but all of us can be reborn into Christ, in Jesus. He's the new starting point. We talked about Jesus bearing the penalty for our sin, being our substitute, taking what's ours to give us what's his. Of Jesus destroying the power of sin and death, that not even death could hold his people back. Of Jesus' love that is so transformative, our lives become so very, very different. And you can see it in Isaiah 53 when you look closely at those words. In fact, in verses 4 through 6, all you really need to do is look at the pronouns, the words that are used there, he and we, his and ours. He has borne our infirmities. He carried our diseases. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Punishment was upon him, but it makes us whole. His bruises, our healing. God lays on him our iniquity. Jesus gets it all right. Suffering may shatter us, but Jesus took what is ours to give us what is his. Jesus gets it. And because he gets it, we all have the opportunity to reframe it, with opportunity to consider our suffering in the light of his. Those of us who follow Jesus, we know some of this. I mean, we understand to some extent that Jesus died for our sin, that he became the sin bearer and the life giver, that we can know God's forgiveness and grace in our lives, that he sets us free. I don't know that we think quite as much, though, about him bearing our griefs and our sorrows, our infirmities and our diseases, our pain and our suffering. How might it be possible to reframe your suffering, my suffering, in the light of Jesus? What would that look like? Corrie ten Boom was born. I see all the Dutch people there because you won your soccer game this morning. You got your T-shirts on. That's very cool. Corrie ten Boom was born in April 1892 in Haarlem in the Netherlands, where our son, their daughter-in-law, and our two little grandchildren, Avery and James, all live, not too far from Corrie's house, actually. She was the youngest of 4 children, became the first licensed watchmaker in the Netherlands. Her dad was a watchmaker and had a shop that he'd inherited from his dad. The shop's still there, and you can still buy watches there. And the family lived upstairs. When the Netherlands was invaded by the Germans in May 1940, she saw how people, Jewish people particularly, were being persecuted in her hometown, and knew she needed to do something about it. So she would take her bike and ride along to meet with people underground as part of the Dutch resistance movement, beginning to find ways to get ration books and coupons that they could give to people or get resources for people so they had something to eat. And eventually moving on to beginning to find shelter for people where they could take care of them and perhaps help them move somewhere safer. Her story was recorded in one of her books, The Hiding Place, that turned into a movie. And upstairs in the flat where everybody lived in the apartment, there's a tiny opening in a false wall that would take people in. You could crawl through the opening and stand there. I've been in it. There's room for about 6 people to stand like this. All day, all night, no moving, no doing nothing, no going to the bathroom, no eating, just standing, waiting, waiting, waiting. She was eventually betrayed. Her whole family were arrested. She was taken by the Gestapo to a prison and put into solitary confinement because of their belief that she was a key leader in the resistance. Eventually, she was released from prison, but transported with her sister Betsy to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. An estimated 35,000 women lived there at any one time. Their experience and their treatment is horrendous. Stripped naked as they entered into the camp, they were huddled in barracks where they were forced to sleep in crowded conditions, in beds that were covered and infested with lice. They would be woken at 4 a.m. in the morning for roll call, worked long days, watched over, beaten and berated by guards. And all the time you could smell the corpses being incinerated in the crematorium. Betsy died in Ravensbrück in December 1944. Corrie, her sister, was released later that same year. She writes in her own words, "Life in Ravensbrück took place on 2 separate levels, mutually impossible. One, the observable external life, grew every day more horrible. The other, the life we lived with God, daily grew better, truth upon truth, glory upon glory. Sometimes I'd slip my Bible from its little sack with hands that shook so much, so mysterious did it become to me. It was new. It had just been written. I marveled that the ink was dry on the page. I had read 1,000 times the story of his arrest, how Jesus, the soldiers had slapped him and laughed at him and flogged him. Now such happenings had faces and voices. Fridays, the recurrent humiliation of medical inspection, The hospital corridor in which we waited was unheated, and a fall chill had settled into the walls. Still, we were forbidden to even wrap ourselves in our own arms, but had to maintain our erect hands at the sides position as we filed slowly past a phalanx of grinning guards. How could there have been any pleasure in the sight of these stick-thin legs and hunger-bloated stomachs? I could not imagine. Surely there is no more wretched sight than the human body unloved and uncared for. Nor could I see the necessity for complete undressing. When we finally reached the examination room, a doctor looked down each throat, another, a dentist presumably, looked at her teeth, and a third in between each finger, and that was all. Then we trooped along again down the long, cold corridor and picked up our X-marked dresses at the door. It was one of those mornings, while we were waiting, shivering in the corridor, that yet another page in the Bible leapt into life for me. He, Jesus, hung naked on the cross. The paintings, the carved crucifixes, showed at least a scrap of a cloth, but this I suddenly knew was the respect and reverence of the artist. But at that time itself, on that other Friday morning, there had been no reverence, no more than I saw in the faces around me. "Betsy," she whispered, "they took his clothes too." And ahead of me I heard a little gasp. "Oh, Corey," and I never thanked him. Learning to reframe their suffering in the light of Jesus' suffering. Paul, the great missionary, listed out some of his own journey for us. You can read about it in 2 Corinthians 11. He says this: 5 times I've received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, dangers from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. But he also writes in the same letter, we do not lose heart. Even though our outward nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed day by day. For our slight and momentary affliction, think about it, what he's just come through. Our slight and momentary affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure, because we look at not what can be seen, but what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. There is a measure of comfort and healing and hope that comes from beginning to see our situation in the light of Jesus as we choose to reframe the picture of our lives. You're not alone. No matter how much it hurts, no matter what has been done to you, you're never alone. Jesus has promised always to be with you, and he has lived your experience and says he is there with you. He knows. He understands. We don't need to lose heart. There is healing to be found in Jesus. Suffering may well shatter us, but we know that Jesus gets it, and that allows us to reframe it. Even better, God redeems it. God takes the mess of our lives and our world, and he says that he's making it all new again. He's making everything new. Jesus, who was crucified, was raised to life, and a new force of life and love spilled out into the universe because of him. The new creation has already begun. Those who worry a lot about the end times, they started 2,000 years ago, and they're still going because Jesus is making everything new. His friend Peter, quoting Isaiah 53, trying to help people understand, would say this: he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that having died to sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds, you have been healed. Jesus heals. He rescues us from sin and from death, and he can heal us too from pain and from suffering. How? Theologian Stephen Seamands writes these words: God's solution to the problem of suffering and evil is not to eliminate it, nor to be insulated from it, but to participate in it. And then, having participated in it, to transform it into his instrument for redeeming the world. In other words, this is not so much a remedy for pain and suffering as it is an opportunity to reuse it. The stuff that we can't imagine could bring any good, the things that are just bad and wrong and evil and hurtful, God can still do something with them. It's not that he caused those things, understand me well, but he can still make something out of all of it regardless. He can still transform them. The tragedy of the cross becomes the triumph of an empty grave through the resurrection. The grotesque spectacle of Christ being crucified before all these people is turned into the glory and wonder of new life that he brings to all who would receive him. The classic Old Testament story about this is the story of a young man, Joseph, the one with the Technicolor Dreamcoat in the book of Genesis. To be honest, Joseph's a spoiled brat. A tremendous sense of self-importance and little self-awareness or self-control. And he had a host of jealous brothers as well, who eventually had enough of him and one day thought the better of having him around much more and sold him off as a slave and then went and told their dad he was killed by a wild beast. Joe, he's still alive. He ends up in Egypt. He's a slave, but he gets a cushy number eventually. Works in service for a family, an important family where he's well treated. Until his boss's wife hits on him and he refuses, she cries rape, and he ends up in prison. It's a long story. Eventually, Joe gets released because he's got an amazing job helping Pharaoh plan and organize for a famine that's about to come to the country. Joe becomes the prime minister. Famine hits the entire region, including where his dad and his brothers are living. They're starving, and so they come down to Egypt looking for grain. 22 years have passed since they sold their brother off as a slave. They've never given him a second thought. They have no idea that the person they're standing in front of asking for food is actually their little brother, Joe. The story is quite humorous, actually, when you read it. Joe messes with their minds. It's really worth taking the time to read the few chapters in Genesis. He messes with their minds. He screws about with them for a while. But eventually he reveals himself to them, tells them who he is, and their entire family is reunited. It's a bit of a happy ever after story, I know that. But I want you to listen to Joseph's words in Genesis 45. He says this to his family. "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there'll be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it wasn't you who sent me here, but God. He's made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." Something they intended to do harm, to destroy, but God could redeem it and transform it and use it for good. God doesn't cause the bad, but nevertheless he can take it and do something with it. Nothing goes to waste. If you like, you could think of God as being the ultimate recycler. The ruin of our lives he can redeem and turn into something. You see, it's in the potential from the future, not the pain of the past, that we discover God's hand. God's not causing every situation, every hurt, every terrible thing. It's not as though we've got to try and find God must have had a reason for this. He didn't make it happen. But he can use it. Every hurt, every betrayal, every disappointment, every agonizing moment, he can still take it and redeem it and use them despite what they are. Joseph's story of slavery and prison, God redeemed it and used his circumstances to save many people from famine. Paul's story, being beaten, being chased by all and sundry, God used him as he would flee from place to place to tell the story of Jesus wherever he was going. My little story of dealing with a degenerative neurological problem, God redeems that too, because then I get to tell the story of God's grace that's always sufficient, because Jesus is always enough. Suffering may well shatter us. I get that. But Jesus truly gets it. And because he gets it, we can reframe it. We can see it differently. And even better still, God can redeem it and make use of that brokenness in our lives. I'm going to ask you if you'd do something for me if you're in the room. If you're online, maybe you can participate on the chat to do this. But if you're sitting here, I'm going to invite you to do something, and that would be to stand up. If you're here a person and you really have experienced long-term suffering in your life, I'm going to ask you to stand. Now, I'm not going to do nothing weird to you. I just want you to stand in solidarity and see how many people stand with you. If you're able to stand, would you do that right now? Or raise a hand if you can. If your life is marked by suffering, just have a look at this room. Maybe quietly you could even pray. It's a sacred moment. We're not alone. Not even in this room or you online. We are not alone. You can take your seats. There's another sacred moment that I'd like us to participate in. We call it communion. I hope you got your little cup on the way in. It's really a participation in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, because his invitation comes to all of us. Let me read those words again. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And so, Father, today we thank you for Jesus, for his life, experiencing our life, for his death to sin and his triumph over the enemy and over evil and over death itself, that he has been raised to new life and offers to us the gift of life eternal. We thank you that he's poured his Spirit out upon his people. We thank you that he is here and present to us today. And we thank you for these little cups that we hold that remind us so dearly that Jesus has joined us. And no matter how long or difficult the road becomes, he said he will be with us to the end of the age. And so today we say thank you for Jesus. Amen. The night of his betrayal, as they had a meal together, Jesus took bread. And when he'd given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body broken for you. We eat together and are thankful." After supper, he took the cup. And as they looked astonished at him, he said, "This is the new covenant in my blood shed for you for the forgiveness of sins." Jesus did it all for us. Let's drink and be thankful.